Hey folks, it's Mira Dessy, the ingredient guru, and I am here today with a really special treat for you. So as you guys know, I am talking all the time about what is in and on our food so that we can build that awareness about making healthy choices and making dietary changes that are going to support good health. One of the things that I don't talk about as much, but that is just as important, is getting to know the people who grow your food, getting to know your farmer, and understanding the process of agriculture because, hey, that's where our food comes from. And, you know, one of the other things that's going on, there's this whole process of something called restoration agriculture, and it's hugely important. So I have turned to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Arland Hill, and asked him to hop on and chat with me about that so we can all learn more and really be involved and educated about this process. Arland, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, Mira. It's good to be on here with you, and I know we're going to have a good conversation around something I'm extremely passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. I love the conversations that we've been having as you have been working on your little piece of heaven. Do you want to tell us a little bit about you and then a little bit about the property, and then we'll dive in from there?
Yeah, so there are probably a couple of things that are relevant in my history that have led up to the point where I'm at right now. And the first of which is that I actually grew up in a conventional farming family. So I saw where gardens were raised and my family grew their own food, and they had intermingled in a few conventional things, but they were ultimately still growing all their own food for the most part. And then ultimately, as some of my family members got older, we saw a transition to more conventional practices as we began leasing the greater portion of the farmland. And of course, with that, in the mindset of convenience and better life by science, right? Which we all kind of know now to be a little bit of a fallacy. You know, I have that as my background to sort of look back to and have some wonderful learning lessons from. But as I got a little older, going to school, ultimately moving through my education into becoming a functional medicine doctor, I certainly began to have more of a foundational science-based appreciation for nutrition, the role that it served. But you know, as your education and your interest in things continues to evolve and you keep asking questions, ultimately where I found myself was spinning back around to agriculture and finding out that if I'm ultimately going to try to help someone truly improve their health long term, that meant also laying a foundation for them that was based around food. And you know, you and I have such a strong appreciation for that. And what I found as I dove back into this and made the decision, my wife and I made the decision to purchase a ranch and really not just preach this message, but to live this message and to show how it really plays out firsthand. What we began to realize really quickly is that some of the things that I was going to use as a foundation for my background really weren't the best way to go about doing things. And so literally, you know, in the last year, our learning curve has been substantial. I feel like we have made some changes and currently put our ranch in a position to really drive this restoration agriculture. Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, Mira, you know, you have, it's not just about producing food or organic food, and we kind of use these terms sometimes a little bit elusive in what the actual definitions of those are. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, you have to have good quality food. It's not just about having the food. You've got to have nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense food. And there's a lot more that goes into that than just sticking a seed in the ground and watering it and watching it come up.
Yeah, and that's so important. You know, I think a lot of times we have people who have been conditioned to think that organic means it's great, but even organic produce grown in impaired soil is still not going to give you the optimal food that you're looking for. So can you take just a second and explain what the concept of restoration agriculture is?
I can, and I think that's such an important definition to really clarify, because many people have heard the terminology sustainable agriculture, and the mindset around sustainable agriculture is that you're not going backwards, so you're keeping the land and the environment as is. But restoration agriculture goes the other direction. Instead of just staying at status quo, it actually pushes the land back in a positive direction, where you're literally beginning to rebuild the soil, you're rebuilding the environment around the land in terms of different microorganisms coming back into that environment. There's an influx of these different microorganisms. And the way that we're going about doing that is really working harmoniously with the animals around us. So again, I came from that conventional mindset where we used equipment to try to accomplish a lot of things. And it's funny, because the further I've gotten into this and the more we've been able to implement, it's literally the less equipment I have to use to make things happen, and I shouldn't even say that, because it's not making things happen. It's using less equipment and using the livestock and the animals to carry out their natural roles in what they can do for the land, and they don't abuse the land. They actually, when they're managed accurately and appropriately, they're very rehabilitative to the land.
And see, that's wonderful. I know I've had the opportunity to, in several different cases, go to places where they are practicing that restorative aspect of agriculture, and rotating the animals and making sure that they're using proper land management. And it's amazing to see how a little piece of land can actually produce an enormous amount when it's properly managed.
It is, and it was also really amazing to me to begin to understand more about the animals and the roles that the animals serve in this process, because carrying out a restoration project without, whether it's livestock or whether it's some type of fowl such as chickens or ducks or turkeys, whatever that ends up being, carrying that process out without those animals in place is a much more difficult task. And when you can align how those animals, as you alluded to, how those animals move throughout the property, and they take the grass off of an area, and then they turn around and they defecate in that area, but that defecation is it's a natural fertilizer. And it ultimately, through the microbial action that comes along as a byproduct of that, as long as those animals continue to move and they're not staying sedentary in a limited space, there's going to be a continual rehabilitation. You'll find that the grass will actually start to turn over much quicker. Whereas a lot of times individuals will drive by a pasture and they'll see this beautiful green, lush pasture. I don't want my pastures to be beautiful, green, lush pastures. That's not what I'm interested in. I want my pastures to be beautiful, but I want my pastures to have a lot of diversity and color in them as well, because I want that plate, if you will, for that animal to be diversified, because we know that different plants have different nutritional aspects to them. And if that animal is sitting there eating the same forage over and over and over, we've limited the nutrient intake that animal can consume, and which that also means that what they ultimately provide back to the land. And then if that animal is one that is used ultimately as a feed source for us or as a meal source for us, then that means that animal that has a more diverse palate is going to have a better nutrient profile than one who has a very limited option of forage to take in.
Well, and you and I've talked a little bit about this before, but I want to let people know that just as what we eat impacts our microbiome, what they eat impacts their microbiome. And if you're looking at their end product, if you will, being the fertilizer for the property, the more microbes they have, the more diverse their intestinal culture is, the better off the land is, and it then becomes this very positive upward cycle. I'll
share.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll share my favorite story since I've learned this and have been able to watch this. And that is when you look at the daily routine of cows. I'll use those cows as the example. When you look at their daily routine, they forage for about somewhere between around 8 to 9 hours per day. So there's a little bit of a window there, but that's about it. And the rest of the time, they're either pretty much just standing around in the pasture, or they're actually laying down. I just over the top of my computer screen right now, I'm actually looking out into the pasture where they're at, and they're laying down in the pasture out there. But the reason I say this is that the time that they're not foraging, what they're actually doing is ruminating, and hence the reason we call them ruminants. And that is what ultimately builds up that bacteria and nourishes the bacteria in them that supports a lot of the nutrient production that which we can then ultimately benefit from, or the land benefits from.
That's really cool. And so how long has I mean, I'm sure it's been around for a long time, but how long has it been since this whole concept of restorative agriculture has really taken hold and begun to become, a reintroduced part of the agricultural scene?
Unfortunately, not long enough. A lot of these concepts around restoration agriculture evolved from the permaculture community, and so that really found its place somewhere in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And so since then, there have been individuals that have furthered that message. One of the individuals I really have found a lot of benefit from reading their work is a gentleman named Mark Shepard, who has a farm up in Wisconsin, where this whole concept around restoration agriculture has really, in the last 15 years, just been validated at a very, very high level, that this is something that can absolutely be done. It can be done in a lot of different, really anywhere. But into the 80s is where I think it started gaining a little more traction. And then in the 90s, you really started seeing individuals try to implement this as a full-scale strategy for their land.
Now, and that's really, fascinating to me, because it seems like that's actually sort of been the precursor to this whole food movement that we've seen. And so to me, that's kind of fascinating that the agriculture began first, but really is now lagging behind in terms of awareness, whereas the food sort of got the idea, became very popular, people became very aware of that, and now they're just beginning to become more aware of sourcing and how their animals are raised, how their food is raised.
Well, and honestly, Mira, that is where I feel like my position is at right now, is that I have this functional medicine background. I've been out there as a presenter in the functional medicine world. And so I've been very in tune with that world for the last 15 to 20 years, and realizing that I have this passion for agriculture, but yet those two, even though they are so consistent and so dependent upon each other, they are disconnected in many ways as well. And so I feel like my place is to straddle that line between those two and help drive the connection between good health and connecting with the farmer, who's ultimately the one that is producing that food and doing it the right way.
Sure. Well, and so that actually brings up a really interesting question, because, in sustainable agriculture, we hear all of this terminology around local food, getting to know your farmer, and all of that. So I'm assuming that restorative agriculture is the same thing. It's not like you're going to, grow something on your farm and ship it to Sheboygan. Like, if people want it, they got to come to you. And so I guess part of my question is, how do consumers reach out to connect with people who are restoring the land and who are recommitting to that truly deep process?
Yeah, thankfully on this, there's probably the best resource that we've seen to drive this, or advocacy groups around it, that are really highlighting some of these farms that are out there doing things the right way. One of the ones, I just came across another one last night that was really good. It was eatwild.com. And really what it's doing is it's allowing farmers to have a voice and share what it is they do, whether that's poultry that they offer, whether it's pork or cattle or whatever their options are. It allows them to be highlighted and allows individuals that they can literally go to a map of the U.S., they can look in their area, and they can find out who the farms are in that area that are doing things the way that we're talking about here.
That's really cool. And so what are some of the things that you're growing on your farm? And how big is it?
So we have 102 acres, and the way our property breaks down, at current we have about 65 acres that are in pasture land. And so that pasture land is in an intensive grazing management system. So literally the livestock are moved across the land in a very in a very systematic manner, so that we don't run into issues with overgrazing. So about 65 acres is in pasture land. We've got a large portion of the rest of it is going to be in wooded area. And so we're moving towards something in these wooded areas that's known as silvopasturing. And what silvopasturing means is that you integrate the pastures into the woodland. And so what we're ultimately going to be doing is thinning out some of the shrubs and some of the lower, thinner trees in these areas that just aren't going to be productive trees, and that are ultimately inhibiting some of the growth of the more productive trees. But the unique thing about this is that it allows for another area for the cattle to move into, to be able to forage on. And again, just like we've talked about the restoration that they're doing as they move across the pastures and helping diversify the different types of plants that are in that area, they're going to do the same thing when they move into these more wooded areas as well. We do currently have about 1.5 acres that is a mix of orchard and vineyard. And what we've done in these areas is we use a technique called alley cropping. And so what alley cropping means is you have an alley between rows of trees. So we'll have, for example, we'll have one row of trees, we'll have another row of trees, and then in between them, we'll have an alley where we're growing annual plants. So a lot of times what people think about as tomatoes, cucumbers, their squash species, those are the things that we grow in there. But in the tree section themselves, these are the perennial plants. These are the plants that are going to stay there from year to year, that we don't have to come back and reseed every year. But the nice thing about that is that it provides a base around those annual crops, where it does take some manipulation of the land, very minimal as we try to do it. We try to adhere to a minimal till process, so we try not to disrupt the land any more than we have to. But in doing that, it allows us to be able to take crops that are very commercial crops that most people would be accustomed to eating, and be able to provide those as a nutrient resource. We're real big on, in my functional medicine experience has taught me that a diverse palate is a good thing to have. So one of the things you ask, well, what do we grow? I like to take it from the strategy of maybe what do we try not to grow? We try to incorporate in as many different things as we can. We've got all these different types of squash. We've got several different types of tomatoes and cucumbers. So it's pretty diverse, to be honest with you, in terms of what we're trying to grow.
That sounds really cool. And, you know, I think one of the things that sounds so fascinating about that is how interdependent it all is, but it also sounds like there's this, you know, beauty because you'll have a much more visual record of the seasons for the way that you've laid things out. And so, I mean, I would love to come see that because it sounds amazing.
Well, you know that there's an invitation for you just waiting to be taken advantage of. So yes, I definitely want you to come see it in motion. It's one thing to hear it. It's certainly another thing to see it. And as you alluded to, go through these change of seasons. We're at a point right now where we just came out of the spring and moving into early summer. And of course, that's, in terms of plant growth, that's the most prolific time of year. So we definitely have an abundance of colors at this point. But it really goes back to that interdependence and how all these different, whether we're talking about the plants and the animals and the microbes, how all these things just synergistically work together. And I'll tell you the thing that's been most interesting to me in watching this is, as we've taken, and we're only in year one, right? So, I mean, I by no means think that I'm at the pinnacle of where I want to be. I mean, I feel like I've got multiple years ahead of me of trying to get this, to get literally all this restoration agriculture in place to where I want it. But a lot of times farmers and gardeners are fighting insects. And it's been really interesting, Mira, because we have applied, we're no chemicals. I'm just an advocate of no chemicals. I could get on my soapbox and talk about that on and all the problems associated with that, even beyond toxicity, and just what a failed methodology and mindset that is, probably better stated as a failed mindset. But we literally don't have these problems with the insects destroying our crops. And I feel like a lot of that is because the crops have the underlying nutrition that they need to be able to defend themselves. Do they still have blemishes on them? Yes, they have blemishes on them. But are they good, nutrient-dense food? Yes, they are. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not trying to grow pretty food per se. That's not my end goal. I don't care if it has a blemish on it. If the consumer doesn't want the blemish, it can end up on my plate. That's totally fine with me. I'm interested in the food that has the greatest nutrient density, that's going to nourish my body and nourish the microbes within.
And you know, Arland, it's so interesting that you should say that, because just this week in my newsletter, I talked about this whole ugly food movement. You know, we've been conditioned by grocery stores and food producers to only accept pretty food because they somehow have taught us that it should all look the same. But honestly, even, you know, growing tomatoes, I mean, I have a very tiny kitchen garden, and so I grow tomatoes. I get no two tomatoes that are all the exact same uniform shade of red. You know, there's little differences in them. And I think you're right. It's like the blemish doesn't really matter. What matters is how much nutrition are you getting, because the ultimate goal is to feed and nourish your body.
Right. So to your point, we, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we finalized digging our regular potatoes, our Irish potatoes for the spring. And we literally separated them out, and we had the ones that we looked at and said, those are marketable because they don't have the blemishes. The ones with the blemishes are the ones sitting on my countertop right now that we're using as part of our diet. And they're wonderful. They taste exactly the same.
You know, I'm wondering if there's like this business in a CSA box for ugly vegetables that need love too, you know?
Right.
Right. And so, you know, again, Arland, though, I mean, I love hearing you talk about this, because I think this is something that most consumers miss, because it's not like you're going to go to a grocery store and be able to have this broad variety of, you know, different things, different kinds of food, and, you know, that seasonal aspect of eating as well. So if a consumer is looking to connect with a farmer, you had mentioned that there are a number of resources where they can find out sort of who the farmers are in their area. Are people who are doing restoration agriculture using the traditional farmers market and CSA methods, or are they going even further and doing this like come out to the farm thing?
So it's actually both, and I'll also give you a third option in that they're using cooperatives as well. And so that's something that there's a few cooperatives around the country that have allowed the restoration agricultural community to come together and to be able to market their food into, whether it's even say like your grocery stores or other outlets, but it gives them an avenue for distribution of their food. I think one of the best things that I could recommend to anyone listening to this is that, first of all, when it comes to food, you've got to reconnect with food. And when I say that, I do it with the appreciation that most people are disconnected from food, and also that most people don't even realize that they're disconnected with food. But I'll promise you this, when you put some labor into food, and when you know where food comes from, you have a different appreciation for food when it's on your plate and you're eating it. It just means something different. And literally, for the average consumer that that has no interest in doing anything agricultural related, just showing up at the farmer's market and taking that extra effort to go to the farmer's market and have a conversation with the people that are producing the food, is you put more time and effort than just going to the grocery store. And when you're preparing that food and you're feeding it to your family, you're going to feel better about not only what you're feeding them, but you're going to have a connection to that food that you've never had before. And so to me, Mira, that is ultimately where this comes down to. And if that, like I said, if that means going to the farmer's market, and more importantly, a lot of farmers will open up their farms at certain times and allow the individuals that are buying from them or guests to come out. I think that's an important resource to take advantage of as well for a consumer, so you can get a firsthand appreciation for how the whole process plays out, and more importantly, how it should play out. And when I say that, you know, it's when we go to the point of butchering a calf, or, you know, we send something to the butcher, the process that these small independent butchers do is much different than what is going to take place at a packing facility. Mm-hmm. And the environment is completely different. How that animal is handled is completely different. And sometimes that's done on the farm. A lot of times it's not, depending on the animal we're talking about. But there's just such a greater appreciation when you can actually see that animal and see how it's handled and know that time and effort that was spent into that animal, how that ultimately ended up on your plate. When you see that connection draw out, your appreciation for food is drastically elevated. And it just means, bottom line, your health is going to come along and be improved as a byproduct of that.
Yeah, and I love that, because I know certainly in my own practice and as a functional medicine doc, you've seen this as well. When people really make that connection with the quality of their food and the sourcing of their food, you get a totally different shift in how it impacts your health and wellness. So that's really huge. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing. This is amazing, and I am going to take you up on that offer and come see you so that we can learn
Please
more.
do.
Say hello. Yes, who knows? Maybe we'll get lucky. There'll be some calves. But even
I've got 3 on the ground right now, and hopefully there will be by the time we can make it happen, maybe I'll have 2 or 3 more on the ground.
Oh, that sounds awesome. But no, I want to thank you. And if people wanted to connect with you and learn more about what you're doing, how would they find you?
Yeah, so very simply, our website and our outlet is so drarlandhill.com. So just drarlandhill.com.
Perfect. Well, and I'll put that in the notes below the video so people can check that out. Folks, thanks so much for joining in. I hope you learned a lot. I know it's been really amazing. And, make sure that you stay in touch. You can click like, subscribe down below, and we'll be back later with more videos for you. Thanks so much. Bye.